I knew it was going to be one of those mornings the moment the woman in the white Lexus stepped out of her car, slammed the door, and shouted loud enough for the whole gas station to hear. Go ahead and smile while you can, because the police are about to put you in handcuffs. The smell of fresh gasoline hung in the warm Texas air while the pumps hummed steadily beside me, the digital numbers ticking upward for a pickup truck parked at Pump 3. It was just after 7:30 a.m., the kind of quiet small-town morning where the sun hits the chrome on the fuel pumps and the sound of gravel under tires echoes across the lot. I'd been back in town for 2 weeks, long enough to reopen my father's old gas station, but not long enough for the whole town to realize who I was. My name's Jake Lawson, and most people around here just see a guy in a grease-stained work shirt running a family business that looks like it's been standing here since the Reagan administration. The faded red canopy still rattles when the wind picks up, and the coffee inside tastes exactly like it did when I was a kid sitting on the counter while my dad worked the register. That morning had started quiet. A couple of ranchers filling diesel tanks, a school bus rumbling past on County Road 14, and the low whir of the pump motor behind me. Then the Lexus rolled in like it owned the place. Perfect white paint, chrome wheels, HOA sticker on the windshield big enough to read from 30 feet away. The driver stepped out wearing sunglasses and the kind of expression that said she'd never been told no in her life. Margaret Holloway. Around here people usually just call her Maggie, though never to her face unless they want a lecture about property standards and community rules. She walked up to the pump, tapped the nozzle against the side of her SUV like she was already annoyed with the world, and said, "Fill it." No hello, no card, just an order. I wiped my hands on a rag and told her the same thing I tell everyone. Pump's right there. Regular's $3.62 a gallon today. The look she gave me could have soured milk. She pulled off her sunglasses slowly, like she expected the reveal. To change everything. You must be new, she said. HOA board members don't pay for gas here. The hum of the pumps seemed louder all of a sudden. Somewhere behind me a screen door creaked open as one of the regulars stepped out with his coffee, already sensing the kind of scene that spreads through a town before lunchtime. I leaned against the pump and shook my head. Not here, ma'am. That was the moment her smile disappeared. Her fingers tightened around her phone, knuckles pale against the glossy case. She stared at me like I'd just insulted the entire neighborhood. Then she turned slightly, so everyone on the lot could hear her, and tapped 3 numbers into her phone. The distant sound of a dial tone cut through the warm morning air. Yes, she said sweetly, loud enough for the crowd forming near the ice machine. I'd like to report a business owner refusing service and harassing a resident. She looked straight at me when she said the next part, her voice dripping with confidence. Send an officer. I want this man arrested. And just like that, the quiet little gas station my father built 40 years ago became the most interesting place in town. The call ended, and she lowered the phone slowly, like someone placing a final piece on a chessboard she believed she had already won. The quiet around the pumps changed. You can feel it when a scene is about to unfold in a small town. The rancher at Pump 3 stopped squeezing the diesel handle and leaned against his truck. The screen door to the station creaked again as another customer stepped outside, coffee in hand, pretending not to watch. Maggie Holloway slipped her sunglasses back on with a satisfied little motion and rested one hand on her Lexus like it was part of her personal kingdom. You should have just done the smart thing, she said, voice calm now, almost cheerful. People who cooperate with the community usually do very well here. The wind carried the faint smell of hot pavement and gasoline across the lot while the pump motor hummed behind me. I had heard that tone before. The calm voice people use when they believe the rules belong to them. I folded the rag in my hand and set it on the metal pump housing. Ma'am, I said, everybody pays for gas here. Her smile tightened. Not board members. The way she said it made it sound like she was explaining gravity to a child. She gestured toward the sticker on her windshield. Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Around here that sticker meant something to certain people. Maggie had been president of that association for almost 5 years. Long enough for half the neighborhood to treat her like a city council meeting on wheels. She measured lawns with a ruler. She sent letters about mailbox paint. She once tried to fine a retired teacher because his porch light was the wrong shade of yellow. People told stories about her the way fishermen talk about storms. Always with a little shake of the head and a quiet laugh after she drove away. I had heard those stories during my first week back. This station had been closed for nearly a year after my father passed. The pumps were dusty when I unlocked the doors again. The old coffee pot still worked. The neon sign in the window buzzed like it always had. It felt like reopening a time capsule. The first few days people came by mostly to look around. Old farmers, delivery drivers, folks who remembered my father leaning on the same counter I stood behind now. They told me the town had changed while I was gone. More rules, more letters, more people acting like they owned things they did not build. Maggie Holloway's name came up in almost every conversation. Just wait until she notices you. One mechanic told me while paying for $20 of regular. She notices everything. I guess he was right. Maggie tapped the hood of her Lexus with one polished fingernail and glanced around at the small group forming near the ice cooler. You really should think carefully about how you handle this, she said. This station depends on the neighborhood, and the neighborhood depends on me. Somewhere in the distance a siren began to echo faintly across the hills. Not loud yet, just a distant wail carried by the wind from town. Maggie heard it too. Her smile widened. Perfect timing, she said softly. The rancher at Pump 3 lifted his hat slightly and looked at me with the expression of someone who had seen a lot of mornings unfold exactly like this one. The kind where someone important thinks they are about to teach a lesson. Gravel crunched at the edge of the lot as a patrol car turned off the road and rolled slowly toward the pumps. Maggie folded her arms and waited like a queen expecting the guards to arrive. You should start thinking about how you are going to explain this, she said quietly. The patrol car stopped near Pump 2. The engine idled. The driver door opened with a soft click. Maggie did not look at the officer stepping out. She kept her eyes on me the whole time, already enjoying the victory she believed was coming. The patrol car door closed with a soft metallic thud, and the officer stepped out into the warm morning sunlight, adjusting his duty belt as he walked across the gravel toward the pumps. The faint smell of gasoline drifted through the air while the hum of the diesel pump continued behind me, steady and mechanical, like nothing unusual was happening. Maggie Holloway straightened her posture immediately, the way someone does when they believe the authorities have arrived to confirm what they already decided was true. She lifted one hand and waved politely toward the officer as if greeting an old friend at a neighborhood barbecue. Officer, thank goodness you are here, she called out, her voice suddenly filled with practiced concern. The officer walking toward us was young, maybe late 20s, with the calm expression of someone who had only been on the job long enough to know that most calls in a small town were not emergencies. His name tag read Collins. I had met him once during my first week back when he stopped by the station for coffee at 6 in the morning before his shift started. Back then he had just nodded politely and thanked me for reopening the place. Now he looked slightly confused by the small crowd gathered around Pump 3. Morning, ma'am, he said carefully as he approached. Maggie did not waste a second. She stepped forward and pointed directly at me like she was presenting evidence in court. This man is refusing service and harassing a resident, she said, her tone confident and sharp. I asked for gas, and he flat out told me no. Businesses in this town cannot discriminate like that. The rancher leaning against his truck let out a quiet breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. Collins glanced at me, then at the pump, then at Maggie's Lexus sitting beside us with the fuel door still closed. The officer spoke slowly, choosing his words the way people do when they suspect there is more to the story than the first sentence. Ma'am, did you attempt to pay for the gas? Maggie folded her arms and tilted her head slightly, like the question itself was ridiculous. I am on the Homeowners Association board, she said. Everyone knows the neighborhood supports local businesses. We have an understanding. The word understanding floated in the warm air like it carried more weight than a contract. Collins shifted his stance slightly, clearly trying to piece together the situation. The hum of the pump finally stopped behind me as the rancher finished filling his tank. He replaced the nozzle slowly and leaned against his truck with his arms crossed, watching the exchange like someone who had paid admission to a very familiar show. Maggie continued speaking, gaining confidence with every second the officer listened. If this station wants the support of Willow Creek Estates, then cooperation is expected. Instead, he decided to be difficult. She gestured toward me again with a small dramatic motion of her hand. Frankly, I feel threatened by the way he spoke to me. Collins blinked once, clearly unsure how refusing free gasoline had turned into harassment. The wind carried the distant sound of another vehicle approaching the lot, and somewhere a loose sign rattled softly against the canopy supports. I rested one hand on the side of the pump and said nothing. Sometimes silence tells a better story than a speech. Maggie interpreted the quiet exactly the way she wanted. Her voice became even more confident. "I would like you to handle this immediately," she said. "This kind of behavior cannot be tolerated in our community." Collins glanced between the two of us again, the gears in his head clearly turning while he tried to understand why a quiet gas station had suddenly become the center of a neighborhood dispute. Behind him, another patrol vehicle rolled slowly into the lot and parked near the road. The second engine idled quietly while the door opened. Maggie noticed the second car and smiled wider, convinced that the situation was now fully under control. "Good," she murmured softly, almost to herself. "More witnesses." Collins turned his head slightly when he heard the second door close, and the moment he did, something about his posture changed. His shoulders straightened, and the relaxed confusion on his face faded into something much more alert. Because the officer stepping out of that second patrol car was not just another patrol officer. The second patrol car door closed with a firm click that carried across the gas station lot, and the officer stepping out moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had been wearing a badge for a long time. The morning sun caught the silver bars on his collar as he walked toward us, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. Officer Collins straightened almost immediately, his posture shifting from casual uncertainty to sharp attention the moment he recognized who had just arrived. Maggie Holloway did not notice the change. She was still focused on me, arms folded, chin slightly raised, enjoying what she believed was the final act of a story she had already won. The wind stirred the corner of a faded advertisement taped to the ice freezer, while the faint smell of gasoline hung in the air like a reminder that this was still just a quiet roadside station on a county road. Collins took a half step back as the second officer approached, giving him room to take over the conversation without saying a word. Maggie turned when she heard the footsteps behind Collins, and her smile widened again, the kind of satisfied smile people wear when they think reinforcements have arrived on their side. "Officer," she said brightly, gesturing toward me again with the same confident motion she had used before, "I am glad you are here. This man is refusing service and causing a scene. I already explained everything." The older officer stopped beside Collins and looked around the lot for a moment, taking in the parked trucks, the curious faces near the cooler, the Lexus sitting untouched beside Pump 2. His eyes passed over me briefly, but he did not say anything yet. Instead, he looked at Collins. "What do we have?" Collins cleared his throat slightly. "Resident says the station refused to provide gas," he said carefully. "She believes it is harassment." The older officer's eyebrows lifted just a fraction, the kind of small reaction most people would miss. Maggie stepped forward again before anyone else could speak. "It is not just refusal," she said firmly. "It is disrespect to the community. Businesses here cooperate with the homeowners association. That is how this town functions." The rancher, leaning against his truck, shifted his weight and muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like the word interesting. The older officer turned his attention toward Maggie now, studying her expression for a moment before speaking. His voice was calm, steady, the kind that carries authority without needing volume. "Ma'am, did the station refuse to sell you gasoline, or did the station refuse to give you gasoline for free?" The question hung in the air for a second longer than Maggie expected. Her confident expression flickered briefly, but she recovered quickly. "That is not the point," she said. "Community partnerships require flexibility." The older officer nodded slowly like he was filing that answer away somewhere. Then his gaze shifted toward me again, and this time his expression changed in a way that was impossible to miss. Recognition. The kind that spreads across someone's face before they even realize it is happening. Collins noticed it too. His eyes moved from the older officer to me and then back again. The small crowd near the station door had gone completely quiet now. Even the loose sign hanging from the canopy had stopped rattling in the wind. The older officer took one more step forward and looked at me carefully, as if confirming something he already suspected. Then he spoke, and the tone of his voice changed the entire atmosphere of the gas station in a single sentence. "Chief Lawson," he said calmly, "I did not realize you were working the morning shift today." The words hung in the air like the sudden silence after a siren shuts off. For a second nobody moved. Officer Collins blinked once, then twice, his eyes shifting from me to the older officer, as if his brain needed a moment to catch up. The rancher by pump 3 let out a low whistle under his breath. Maggie Holloway did not react right away. She was still standing there with her arms folded, sunglasses perched on the bridge of her nose, the confident smile frozen halfway across her face. It took a moment for the meaning of those two words to settle in. Chief Lawson. The morning breeze pushed the faint smell of gasoline across the lot, while somewhere down the road a pickup truck passed with a distant rumble. I set the rag down on the pump and gave a small nod toward the older officer. Morning, Sergeant Miller, I said calmly. Maggie's smile disappeared so quickly it was almost audible. She turned her head slowly toward me like she had misheard something. Collins straightened so fast his belt radio crackled softly against the microphone. Sergeant Miller stood relaxed beside the patrol car, hands resting lightly on his duty belt, watching Maggie with the same quiet patience he used during every long shift in this town. Maggie looked from Miller to Collins and then back to me again, the gears in her mind turning so fast you could almost hear them grinding. Chief, she repeated quietly, the words sounding strange in her mouth. The crowd near the station door shifted slightly as a few people exchanged knowing glances. In a small town, news travels faster than wind across open fields, but not everyone hears everything right away. I wiped my hands slowly on the rag and leaned against the pump the same way I had been standing the whole time. Yes, ma'am, I said. Jake Lawson, police chief of Willow County. Maggie blinked again behind her sunglasses. For the first time since she stepped out of that Lexus, she looked uncertain. The confidence that had filled her voice only seconds earlier drained away like air escaping a tire. Sergeant Miller glanced toward Collins and gave a slight nod that clearly said everything was under control. Collins relaxed his shoulders just a little, though he still looked like he had accidentally walked into the middle of a story he did not expect to be part of. Maggie cleared her throat and straightened her posture again, trying to recover the authority she had been using all morning. Well, she said quickly, forcing a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. That is certainly surprising. The rancher near pump 3 shifted his hat back on his head and watched quietly. The diesel pump clicked once as the nozzle settled fully into its cradle. The station was so quiet now you could hear the electric sign buzzing faintly inside the store. Maggie adjusted her sunglasses again, though the movement looked less confident than before. Chief Lawson, she said carefully, her voice softer now. Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. Sergeant Miller raised one eyebrow slightly, but said nothing. I folded the rag once more and set it beside the pump. From where I am standing, I said evenly. The situation looks pretty simple. Maggie hesitated for half a second before answering. I only asked for cooperation from a local business, she said. Community relationships are important. The words sounded different now, less like a command and more like an explanation. Collins glanced toward Miller again, clearly waiting to see how this conversation was supposed to continue. Miller remained calm, the corners of his mouth barely moving. He had seen situations like this before. People who believe the badge always belong to someone else. I met Maggie's gaze for a moment, and then looked toward the patrol cars idling quietly near the pumps. Sergeant, I said calmly, since the call was placed requesting police assistance, we should probably finish documenting exactly what happened here this morning. Sergeant Miller gave a slow nod the moment I mentioned documentation, the kind of nod that meant he understood exactly where the morning was heading. Officer Collins reached for the small notebook on his belt almost automatically, flipping it open with the practiced motion of someone who had written hundreds of routine reports during quiet shifts. The engines of the patrol cars hummed softly in the background, while the warm Texas sun continued climbing higher over the gas station canopy. Maggie Holloway remained standing beside her Lexus, but the posture she had carried only minutes earlier was gone now. Her shoulders were a little tighter, her arms no longer folded with the same certainty. She looked from me to Sergeant Miller again, clearly searching for a way to pull the situation back under her control. I do not think that will be necessary, she said quickly, her voice attempting to recover its earlier authority. This was simply a misunderstanding between a resident and a local business. The rancher leaning against his truck let out a quiet chuckle that he tried unsuccessfully to hide behind the brim of his hat. Sergeant Miller turned slightly toward Maggie, his expression calm but firm. Ma'am, he said evenly. You contacted emergency services requesting police response. That means we document the call. Collins nodded slightly and began writing the time in his notebook. The scratching of his pen sounded unusually loud in the still air. Maggie glanced toward the small crowd gathered near the station door and then back toward me again. The confident smile she had worn earlier had faded into something far more careful. Well, she said slowly, I believe the situation required assistance. I rested one hand on the metal side of the pump, feeling the faint vibration of the machinery cooling down after the last fill up. What exactly did you report during the call? Sergeant Miller asked calmly. Maggie hesitated for half a second before answering. I explained that a business owner was refusing service and creating a hostile situation. Collins paused his writing and glanced up briefly. Did the business owner refuse to sell gasoline? Miller asked. Maggie's eyes shifted toward the pump beside her Lexus. The fuel door was still closed. The nozzle had never even left its cradle. He refused to cooperate with a community agreement, she said carefully. The rancher cleared his throat softly, clearly enjoying the unfolding scene more than his morning coffee. The electric sign inside the store buzzed faintly while a breeze moved across the lot carrying the smell of fuel and sun-warmed asphalt. Sergeant Miller folded his hands calmly over his belt. For our report, we need to be very clear, he said. Did the station refuse payment, or did the station refuse free gasoline? Maggie opened her mouth to respond, but stopped for a moment as the weight of the question settled in. Collins waited quietly with his pen hovering over the page. The small group of onlookers remained silent now, every person listening closely. Maggie finally spoke, her voice lower than before. I expected cooperation from local businesses, she said again, though the words sounded less confident than they had earlier. I glanced toward the security camera mounted above the canopy, its small red light blinking steadily as it recorded the entire scene. Sergeant, I said calmly, the station cameras record audio and video across the lot. Collins looked up from his notebook again. Maggie followed his gaze toward the camera, and for the first time that morning, she seemed to fully understand that every word spoken beside those pumps had been captured. Sergeant Miller gave a small, thoughtful nod. That will make the report very accurate, he said quietly. Sergeant Miller's words settled over the gas station like a quiet shift in the wind. Maggie Holloway's eyes stayed fixed on the camera above the canopy for a moment longer than necessary, as if hoping the small blinking light might suddenly turn off and erase the last 10 minutes of her morning. It did not. The red indicator continued blinking steadily, recording every second just as it had since the station reopened. Officer Collins wrote another line in his notebook, the sound of the pen scratching against paper echoing faintly in the quiet lot. Maggie cleared her throat again, this time slower, more careful. I do not see why cameras would be necessary, she said, forcing a polite tone that felt very different from the voice she had used earlier. The rancher beside Pump 3 pushed his hat back slightly and leaned one elbow on the hood of his truck, clearly enjoying the change in atmosphere. Sergeant Miller remained calm, his hands resting comfortably on his belt. Video helps confirm details, he said simply. Collins glanced toward the camera and then back at Maggie. Standard procedure when a call reports a disturbance, he added. The warm morning breeze moved across the pumps again, carrying the faint smell of gasoline and dust from the road. Somewhere inside the store, the old refrigerator compressor clicked on with a low hum. Maggie looked around the lot, as if noticing the audience for the first time. A delivery driver had stopped near the soda machine. Two customers stood near the door pretending to check their phones, while clearly listening to every word. The entire scene had become the quiet center of the town's morning routine. Maggie adjusted the sleeve of her jacket slowly and tried again. Perhaps we should not make a bigger issue out of this than necessary, she said. I simply expected cooperation from a local business that benefits from our community. I nodded slightly and glanced toward the camera again. That expectation was mentioned a few times, I said calmly. Collins wrote another line. Sergeant Miller watched Maggie carefully, the patient look of a man who had spent decades observing people realize they were standing on the wrong side of a situation. Maggie's voice softened another step. Surely this does not require a formal report, she said. Collins lifted his eyes briefly from the notebook. The report already started when dispatch logged the call, he explained. Maggie blinked. The rancher near the truck shifted his weight again, the faint creak of leather boots against gravel breaking the silence. Maggie finally looked directly at me. Again, searching my expression like she was hoping to find some sign of sympathy. "Chief Lawson," she said carefully. "As a community leader, you understand the importance of maintaining good relationships between residents and businesses." The sentence sounded like an attempt to rebuild a bridge that had already burned down. I folded the rag slowly and set it on the pump. "Good relationships usually begin with clear expectations," I said evenly. Collins stopped writing for a moment and looked toward Maggie. "For the record," he said politely, "did the station ever refuse to sell you gasoline today?" Maggie hesitated again. The answer hung in the air while the low hum of the station equipment filled the quiet space between everyone standing there. Finally she spoke, her voice noticeably quieter than it had been earlier that morning. "No," she admitted. Collins wrote the word down immediately. Sergeant Miller nodded once, a small confirming motion. The camera above the canopy continued recording silently while the sun climbed higher over the station roof. Maggie looked toward the road again, then back at the officers, clearly realizing that the simple story she had planned for the morning had become something very different the moment those patrol cars arrived. Maggie Holloway stood beside her Lexus without speaking for several seconds after Officer Collins wrote the word "no" into his notebook. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the warm morning air hanging over the gas station lot. The blinking red light of the security camera continued recording from above the canopy, steady and patient like it had all morning. Sergeant Miller glanced once toward the camera and then back toward Collins. "That confirms the initial detail," he said calmly. Collins nodded and wrote another line beneath the first one. Maggie shifted her weight slightly beside the pump, the polished heel of her shoe scraping softly against the gravel. The confidence she had carried earlier had faded completely now, replaced by the careful posture of someone who realized the situation had moved beyond her control. The rancher near pump 3 watched quietly while sipping the last of his coffee from a paper cup, his eyes moving between Maggie and the officers. The breeze pushed the smell of gasoline across the lot again while a pickup truck passed slowly on the county road nearby. Maggie finally spoke again, her voice noticeably calmer than before. "If the station is willing to sell the gasoline now, I believe we can conclude this matter," she said. Collins paused his writing and looked towards Sergeant Miller for a moment. Miller considered the statement quietly, then spoke in the same calm tone he had used all morning. "The sale of gasoline was never the issue reported to dispatch," he explained. Maggie blinked once behind her sunglasses. Collins closed his notebook halfway but kept the pen ready in his hand. "The call reported harassment and refusal of service," he added politely. Maggie opened her mouth as if to respond, but stopped again. The small crowd near the station door remained completely silent now, every person watching the conversation unfold. The electric sign inside the store buzzed faintly as the compressor of the cooler cycled again. I rested my hand lightly on the pump and glanced toward the camera once more. "Sergeant," I said evenly, "the footage should show the entire conversation from the moment the Lexus pulled in." Miller nodded. "That will help complete the record." Maggie's eyes moved slowly toward the camera again and then back toward the officers. For the first time that morning, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. "There is no need to review footage," she said quickly. "This situation was clearly a misunderstanding." Collins looked down at the partially written report and then back at her again. "Dispatch logs every call placed through emergency services," he said. "Once the call is logged, it becomes part of the official record." The rancher lowered his empty cup and placed it carefully in the trash can near the pump. The faint clang of plastic against metal echoed softly through the lot. Maggie took a slow breath and adjusted her sunglasses again, though the gesture looked more like a nervous habit than a confident movement now. "I simply expected cooperation from a local business," she repeated, though the words sounded far less certain than they had earlier. Sergeant Miller looked at Collins and gave a small nod. Collins finished writing the final line and closed the notebook with a soft snap. The sun had climbed high enough now to cast long shadows from the pumps across the pavement. Miller turned his attention back to Maggie. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "placing an emergency call requires a clear and accurate reason." Maggie said nothing. The quiet lasted several seconds while the steady hum of the station equipment filled the air. Finally Miller continued, his voice firm but still polite. When emergency services are used for situations that do not involve an actual emergency, that call still becomes part of the official report. Maggie looked from Miller to Collins, and then toward me again. The morning had started with her voice filling the entire lot. Now she stood silent beside the pump while the officers finished documenting exactly what had happened. For several long seconds nobody spoke. The only sound in the gas station lot was the low hum of the refrigeration unit inside the store and the distant rumble of a pickup truck heading down County Road 14. Maggie Holloway stood beside her Lexus with her hands resting stiffly at her sides, no longer trying to control the conversation the way she had earlier that morning. The blinking red light of the security camera above the canopy continued recording quietly while the sunlight reflected off the chrome edges of the fuel pumps. Officer Collins slid his notebook back into the pouch on his belt and looked towards Sergeant Miller, waiting for the final direction that would close the report. Miller nodded once, and then turned back to Maggie. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "the call placed to dispatch will remain documented along with the details we discussed." Maggie inhaled slowly as if preparing to respond, but the words never came out. For the first time since she had stepped out of that white Lexus, she seemed unsure what to say next. The rancher beside Pump 3 tossed his empty coffee cup into the trash can and gave the officers a respectful nod before climbing back into his truck. The engine started with a deep rumble that echoed across the lot, and the truck rolled slowly toward the road. Maggie watched it go for a moment before looking back toward the officers again. "I did not intend to misuse emergency services," she said finally, her voice quiet and controlled. Sergeant Miller nodded slightly. "Intent is noted," he replied. "The report will reflect exactly what happened this morning." Maggie glanced once more toward the camera above the canopy, and then toward me. The expression on her face was very different from the confident smile she had worn less than an hour earlier. It was the look people get when they realize the situation never belonged to them in the first place. Collins stepped back toward the patrol car while Miller finished speaking. "If you still wish to purchase gasoline, the station is free to conduct normal business," Miller said. Maggie hesitated, then shook her head slightly. "That will not be necessary," she replied. The morning breeze moved across the lot again as she opened the door of her Lexus and slid into the driver's seat without another word. The engine started quietly, and the vehicle pulled away from Pump 2, rolling slowly toward the road before turning out onto the county highway. The small group near the station door gradually drifted back to their routines, the quiet excitement of the moment already turning into the kind of story people would be telling over coffee by lunchtime. Collins climbed into his patrol car and started the engine while Sergeant Miller lingered beside the pump for a moment. He looked toward me with a small half-smile that carried years of shared experience working in the same town. "Interesting way to start the morning, Chief," he said. I shrugged slightly and picked up the rag from the pump where I had left it earlier. "Gas station business," I replied. Miller chuckled softly before heading back toward the patrol car. Within seconds, both vehicles rolled out of the lot and disappeared down the road, leaving the station quiet again. The hum of the pumps returned to its familiar rhythm while the sun continued rising over the canopy. I wiped the edge of the metal pump and looked toward the camera one last time. In a small town, people often think authority belongs to whoever speaks the loudest. But sometimes the truth is simpler than that. Real authority does not shout across a gas station lot. It just stands quietly and lets the record speak for itself.